Hi, and welcome to the Intro to Regulatory Compliance for Healthcare presentation. My name is 𝗕𝗿𝗀𝗏. I am a senior consultant for Brightest, and I consider myself as a curious generalist. After a few years as developer, I totally focused on the testing world as of 2013, and since then I have been doing several types of roles and projects. The last years I was involved in test management in a company in clinical research, which brought me to the healthcare business, to the regulatory compliance business. So based on these experiences, I would like to share some ideas with you. So who are you? This is an introduction course. So if you're interested and new to healthcare and regulatory compliance, if you may have an interest to work in such companies, or you're interested in general in concepts such as computer systems validation and good document practices or incident management, then you're at the right spot. In this first section, we will focus on regulation and how it is related to our common software testing activities. Software testing, as most of you know it, focuses on business context and product risks. The goal of testing is to get a sufficient amount of confidence in the product that's being developed to make sure that the quality is high enough. The precise criteria and amount of allowed risk is a decision that's finally made by the company. The methodology and amount of detail may differ per company and its maturity level. So most of the time we are quite release focused. We focus on new items, new functionalities that are in scope for the new release, and we do additionally regression checks on the existing system to make sure nothing else is breaking because of the new changes. Or we can add a layer of non-functional testing. The main points of attention will always be test coverage, a indication of high-level pass and fail rates, and defect management. How you store this information and how you use it may differ per company. When considering risks, we must also consider what if things go wrong. In most cases, in most business contexts, the delivery of potential poor quality software results in things like brand and imaging problems, a loss of trust by your customers, your peers, disadvantaging competition, financial losses, but also possibly fines, lawsuits, and so on. Now consider a couple of different and very typical industries. Think about the nuclear industry. Think about your transportation, like the cars you're driving in, or the planes that are above our heads. Or the banking and financial industry we all rely on. And of course, the life science and medical industry, on which we go on in this presentation. Let's come back to the question, what if things go wrong, for the slides we just saw? In some business contexts, people's lives may be at stake, or the environment can be ruined, social stability can be in danger. In such cases, we have regulators in place that impose and check measures for public safety. It's a set of rules that come on top of general testing practices and procedures that companies have to apply. We must ensure that our testing and reporting strategy fits all of those regulatory needs. So what is regulatory compliance? It is a set of practices that a company must implement to achieve in their operational efforts to ensure that they are aware of and take steps to comply with all relevant laws, policies, and regulations. Those are typically managed by a specific department called quality assurance or QA, and they make sure that all activities within the company should be in line with regulatory or stakeholder expectations. The QA department will most likely use a QMS system to assist in this task. It is not uncommon in the field of software testing to use the term QA. But is it really QA what we are doing? I must say it isn't. What we do is quality control. Software testing is an activity that's at the operational side of things. We are doing things, we are executing business processes, and we are checking business products, so we are doing quality control. Quality assurance does not involve any of those hands-on product-related work, but it is about the formalized processes, risk management, regulations, controlled change management, formal documentation, and all of those templates and structures that are needed to get it all done. So that's the work that the QA department is doing. Testers are doing quality control work. So don't call yourself a QA person in a regulatory context when you're doing software testing. So let's get back to the software testing activities in a regulated context. Now, the primary focus is on the regulatory risks. So we have to get the required coverage and evidence of all what is required by regulation to be allowed in the market with our product or service. The secondary focus is the business product itself. Like we know it traditionally, we focus on the business context and the product to get a sufficient amount of confidence, just like we know it. But it's a second focus point. So the criteria and amount of work on a high level is a decision made by the regulation. The company decides how it organizes itself in the application of these rules and may of course do extra things, but they have to be in line with the regulation at all times. The high-level validation criteria for the product are determined by the regulators. The amount of detail in documentation is also a regulatory requirement. The company simply needs to follow the applicable standards. External inspections and audits will take place to check the compliance of the company and the processes they are following. In the next slides, we will be focusing on differences and similarities between what could be called validation testing, which is more common to regulation, and the more traditional development testing you may be used to. Validation testing is mostly driven by regulatory procedures and templates for validation projects. The focus is rather high level on generic concepts and standards. An important one in that area for electronic, digital, modern systems is the FDA Title 21 CFR Part 11, which handles electronic records and electronic signatures. But in general, most of the topics that will be under focus for regulation and audits are things like data integrity of the system, the traceability of changes to the data called audit logs, data retention, since most of those data needs to be available for multiple decades, digital signatures, system security, physical security, and so on. Next to the validation testing, we also have more change management related testing, also sometimes called development testing. In this case, we're also focusing on product risks like we are used to. It's driven by change requests, smaller changes that are required to be applied to existing validated systems. But we are focusing on the new changes, the new features of a system. The main difference here is that we have to document everything. So every change needs to be risk assessed, justified. So it must be clear why it's needed, why it should be done, what would happen if it's not applied, what risks it resolves, and also every single step we do, from the processes we follow, the test cases we create, the tests we run, everything needs to be provided with evidence. So even every positive test needs a screenshot that says, okay, this is done and it's been okay. Of course, the general defect management is applicable as always. As you may have noticed, regulation will take a lot of time and work. So why are we doing it? Let me take you back a bit in history. First, there's the ethical code. We must absolutely be sure that people are not abused in pseudo-scientific medical experiments, as happened during World War II. Dr. Joseph Mengele, called 𝗕𝗿𝗀 misused a lot of people from the concentration camps with horrible experiments. The second aspect that's very important is patient safety. You want to make sure that everyone involved in medical trials and experiments is safe. Unfortunately, sometimes things go wrong. In the early 50s, the 𝗕𝗿ощ molecule was discovered and considered safe to help pregnant women control anxiety and sleeping problems. Unfortunately, a lot of their babies had malformed arms and legs. The drug was retracted as a consequence. The third important part is integrity and credibility of scientific research. You want to make sure that conclusions that are made are correct and peer-reviewed by other scientists. If not, research gets retracted and consequences stay limited. As a consequence of the Mengele experiments during World War II, the Nuremberg Code was declared in 1947. It's important for its introduction of the voluntary informed consent to make sure that no interventions take place without a patient's permission. Another important landmark in the history is the Declaration of Helsinki, where multiple countries all established ethical principles for medical research involving people, humans. They also elaborated on the informed consent to make it documented and make sure there was an ethics committee to review protocols that are used in studies. Based on the Declaration of Helsinki, the International Council for Harmonization, or ICH, was founded in 1990 by the major players in the EU, US, and Japan. They defined the ICH GCP-E6, which is the Good Clinical Practice. It's an international ethical and scientific quality standard for clinical trials. So it wants to protect the rights and safety and well-being of trial subjects, people involved in those studies, and must make sure that all of the data collected in these studies is credible. Later in 2012, an amendment was added to make sure that at all times the transparency and oversight of this data is guaranteed. Let's have a look at how quality management in a healthcare company takes place. At the heart of the organization, there's the quality management system. It holds formal versions of the quality manuals, policies, operations, work instructions, lists, templates. Everything in a regulated environment is very formalized. So the policies generally will have the implementation of national and international laws or industry standards in them. Business processes or operations will apply policy rules. Work instructions will be very specific information for co-workers on how to apply operations and stuff like that. So the framework is managed by the QA department, but all of these templates and structures are managed in the QA and the QMS system. Furthermore, there's also special attention for the staff information, because we have to know or make sure that everyone in the organization knows what to do and how to do their job. So everyone has a function description that is formally outlined in a document. You have to sign that. You have to provide a CV with your work history, and there's also training records related to people based on their function description to make sure that all of the necessary processes and all of the necessary templates are known by that person, and it's also documented and signed off that this person is qualified to do his job. All of those things are all together in the quality management system. So when we look at the QMS, there's two main blocks of people, two different responsibilities. First of all, there's the QA department. They provide the framework. They make sure that the policies are there and they are correct. So they ensure the regulatory compliance of the quality manual, policies, function descriptions, compliance. They ensure the fact that the processes are reviewed properly and in time. They plan audits, they lead audits, they review documents and approve all kinds of documents that are sent in from the departments. The departments themselves, they provide the content, and must make sure that they implement the procedures correctly. So they provide and maintain their own operations and work instructions and templates, and follow up audit remarks and all kinds of information and directives that come from the QA department. They also follow up the periodic reviews of their systems and operations, and must make sure that the staff of the team of the department is properly trained and fully compliant with what's required for the regulatory compliance of the business. So what can you expect when you would start working in a regulated company? You will likely have to provide your CV. It is a very specific version, a template version from within the company. You have to sign your function description, and you will receive controlled trainings to make sure that you know the business processes and instructions for your work. There will also be at least one person in the team who is closely in contact with the QA department, responsible for compliance. So to make sure that formal procedures and work instructions keep up to date. They provide support for periodic reviews or audits. They make sure that all of the documentation that is generated in day-to-day activities is properly maintained. They check the compliance of people, make sure that everything of audit remarks is followed up properly and stuff like that. So it's an important role. If no one is there to make that bridge, it can be the role of a test manager. It's the kind of work I used to do for quite some time in a growing company. Now let's focus on what's called GXP compliance. GXP is a grouping name for all kinds of good practices. Those are industry standards for regulatory supported approaches. There's more than 30 types of it, and they are mainly used in the pharma and food industries. You just replace the X by another letter and you have one of these subtypes. So most relevant subtypes for IT, or you may see, are the GMP and GDP, being the good manufacturing practice and good documentation practice, since we have to document properly, of course. Other ones that you may see are GLP, like good laboratory practices, or GCP in terms of companies involved in clinical trials, the good clinical practices, and so on. The most important aspect of everything you do in a regulated context is GDP. You just have to document something, or it just did not happen. Clear as that. An important part of GDP is the fact that everything needs to be documented, and it should be clear to anyone. There should be no doubt on why or when people change things. Everything should be documented and annotated properly. So don't leave open spaces. Have decisions on what date formats you will be using. Have certain formats for signatures, and never throw any document away, just make a new version of it. There's more rules to GDP, but that would be in too much detail. When thinking of GDP, the 𝗟𝗂 principles are very important. Those will help you to make sure that a document is very readable in terms of who made it, when was it made, were there edits, is it an original copy, were there any copies made, is it complete, is it consistent. It is absolutely important that the documentation is very readable by people from outside of the organization, and they must be able to reconstruct what was done. Now let's focus on the computer systems validation testing, known as CSV. One of the GXP aspects that's quite important is the GMP. In the US, in the 80s, the ISPE was founded that tried to support companies to implement the FDA GMP guidelines. So they created the Good Automated Manufacturing Practice Guidelines, or GAMP. It is important that you know that this is a level-based system. So there are 5 levels defined, going from very basic systems in the network up to the custom developed software for business needs that you may need. Since we are focusing mostly on business software, most of the times you will see GAMP level 3, 4, or 5 systems. So let's zoom into those levels in more detail. GAMP level 3 is somewhat the lowest level. It's the cheapest level as a consequence. You may use commercial software that is used as is, so you will not change anything. This means that the vendor of this software provides the necessary certificates to make sure it can be used in a validated environment, and the client is responsible only to have these certificates when, for instance, the software is updated. GAMP level 4 is also commercial software that can be bought and integrated. So it's customly adapted, it's configured to the needs of the client. So there the risk is a little higher, so the cost is a little higher. The vendor provides the validation evidence for the basic setup, but the client, the implementer, the client you may be working for, is responsible for the fit for purpose for its own usage. And the correct change management of the configuration. For GAMP level 5, the most expensive, we are talking about custom built or bespoke software created by and for the client. So in this case, there's a lot of risk that needs to be covered. There are high requirements on the testing of this software because of the fact that the client is totally responsible for all aspects and must make sure that the regulated needs are covered by the software. So it's an expensive choice. GAMP has its own V model. So we start off with a validation plan when we start with a validation project. Then we add a risk assessment. We come up with the user requirement specification, functional specification, up until the design specification, which is closely related to the code, of course. At the other side, once code has been applied, we install stuff. So at that point, we do an installation qualification for the basic setup and deploy of the software. Then we have the operational qualification, which is in fact the functional testing. Then performance qualification to make sure that the software is functioning properly in its context. So under that, we see the UAT and or performance testing and stuff like that. To end then with the traceability matrix that makes sure that every risk is tested and covered that was defined in the risk assessment. And we end the project with a validation summary report. So if we take this V model, we can go to a kind of document-based flow as an example. So we start off with a validation plan for the project, where it's very important to cover the risks also. As well regulatory as for the product. So a specified and specific risk assessment is needed where different stakeholders and viewpoints are involved. Then we can make up different protocols that need to be followed. Note that these protocols need to be written out so that they can be signed as well. We make this for the IQ, OQ, and PQ levels. And once all of this documentation is approved, so all stakeholders are involved and have signed off for their approval, these protocols can be executed in order. So we start off with the IQ protocol, then we do, if it's successfully completed, the OQ protocol. If that is successfully completed, we do the PQ protocol. The results of these tests can be summarized in 3 different reports or the same report combined, but that has to be created as well and also signed off, of course, by all stakeholders involved. Then there's near the end of the project also a traceability matrix where we check if all of these things that needed to be tested based on the risk assessment and the protocols is done properly, so to have an end-to-end overview. And there's a global validation report made that describes all of the actions and all of the things in relation with the validation plan that we started off with. Together, if everything is signed again and everything is approved, a release certificate can be provided, which should be signed as well. And after that, the new project can go to production. Once the project's in production, It needs periodic reviews, of course, based on the procedures of the company. And it's very much possible that changes will be needed, so there will be a form of controlled change management on which we come back later. It's important to realize that a lot of these validation testing efforts are still paper-based or maybe PDF-based, but they generate a lot of formal documents. The process is rather slow because a lot of people have to sign in time and things have to be reviewed, but it's also important that the documentation is human readable and available for many years after the project. Another part that's important in relation with modern tools is that it's important that these tools can have portions of their information that are important exported properly to make sure that apart from these tools, the information stays available. In the following section, we will focus on change management and changes applied to the system that's validated. It is important that systems that are validated remain in a controlled and validated state. So there is a process needed that allows you to do some limited change management to add new requirements to the system and make sure that we can test releases separately and make sure that the system stays validated. This is called often the change management control flow. As an example, in the company I worked, we first created a change request. So there was in this document, which is a paper document or a digital paper document, there's an agreed scope. Certain risks are listed that may be associated with that scope. Also a justification for why the release is needed, and all kinds of signatures from technical owners, business involved people, and QA. Once the change request is approved, the development can start. Once people have been developing code, every time they do a formal deploy for testing, an IQ document needs to be generated that lists evidence of the installation itself. Based on that, the functional testing and other testing can go on, and functional testing is summarized at the end of the development cycle in an OQ report, where the UAT sessions or performance tests are in a PQ report. At the end, if the software is ready to be delivered and the reports are generated, all of this information, like the delivered scope, but also a summary of the testing activities, a summary of all the documents that will be included, plus the signature list again of business people, QA, and technical people involved, is combined in a change implementation document. And once this is signed, the change can go to production. What do you do when an urgent incident comes in that needs software changes? In that case, a proper risk assessment needs to take place to make sure that the risk of having this bad situation in production is higher than the risks associated with a quick fix. But if the risks are very high, it's important that we can fix things quickly. In that case, we have an emergency possibility in which we just create user stories based on the incident and or documented mail conversations with business, so they are involved. And then the team starts developing and testing immediately. So as with the previous flow, the deploys and the testing work is fully documented, but maybe we will not do the UAT testing and all of these performance and other things. So we focus on the change we do and potential regression risks there. Then we put the software immediately in production and provide a document to business that summarizes our emergency testing activities. So it's a change request and implementation document, also with the scope of the change, the risks, why we did it, and an overview of all the activities in the development process. So that also needs to be signed by the involved business users, QA, and the technical involved people. Another type of incidents may occur where no direct software change is needed, but where a correction in the data is needed. In that case, it's often documented in a separate way in a so-called 𝗕𝗂 system, a corrective and preventive action system. And it follows a different flow. So in general, a 𝗕𝗂 will be created. So it's a kind of object, often in a quality management system, that says what the problem statement is, what the severity of the problem is, what risks that are involved, the timelines to get it solved, stakeholders, anything goes in of information that's available. Following the creation is a root cause analysis, so technical people are involved to see how it can be fixed. So the fix itself needs to be documented, of course. So if the root cause is determined, a fix is made and it's fully documented and applied to production to make sure that the problem is fixed properly and doesn't become a bigger problem. And together with that, preventive actions will be defined as well. This can be, for instance, a software change that will go into the regular change management flow. So once the immediate action is done and the long-term action is also defined and done, an effectiveness check can be done and the 𝗕𝗂 can be closed. So all of that information is in the 𝗕𝗂 system then. For companies in the regulated space, external control is important. So we'll talk about audits and inspections in this section. So there are different types of audits and inspections possible. The first and quite important kind of checks are the internal audits. So they are executed to check the processes and performance of the company, and are typically executed by the QA department or a QA partner, and are requested by the own company or own procedures, such as, for instance, periodic reviews. The second one are the external audits, and these can be requested by anyone who is a stakeholder, so a business partner or a client or anyone in the private space. Then it's called an audit. If the audit is executed by a regulating government, such as, for instance, the EMA, FDA, or other inspections from government, it's called an inspection. They are in any case performed by an independent auditor, independent from the company. So there's different types of audits also. In case of new partnerships, there may be qualification audits. If there has been an incident, people may be interested and execute an investigation audit. If a scientific study is near closure, there can be a performance audit and so on. So there's different types. In many cases, audits will be announced, but it can be on the spot. Like, for instance, FDA can do this, enter a company and say, okay, we will see how you operate. And audits may happen quite often. In the company I worked, it was about every 2 weeks that I was involved in an audit. So it's quite a lot of work. So who is involved? Who are the people? The investigation is led by an auditor, an independent person. So any information request he or she has should be followed up quickly by the company. Within the company under inspection, so potentially the company you're working in, there's an internal QA officer who will follow up the requests and make sure that everyone and all information and everyone is involved. And all kinds of access are given to the auditor that he needs for his or her investigation, and makes also sure that people from within the company are planned for in-depth interviews and all that kinds of meetings. It's also possible that there is a representative for the institution that required the audit. It's not always the case, and if this person is there, it's more a kind of a witness, but he or she has the possibility to ask the auditor to ask extra questions to the company that's under audit. That's perfectly possible. So when it comes to the contents of an audit, they will focus on quality standards and applicable laws. So they have their context and they will use that as a guidance for their research. This can be FDA or EMA regulations, ISO standards, GAMP regulations, the ICH E6, GDPR. It can be anything or combinations of things. The typical focus points will be facilities compliance, make sure that materials are certified and validated properly, disaster management and recovery, backup procedures and how these are tested, change management and control, which relates to the changes to the software we just discussed, internal review of policies, GDPR compliance. Normally they come up with an agenda and a planning. This may change during an audit, but normally it's most of the times fixed. In my experience, audits take up to most of the time 2 to 3 days, so half a week, and are often on premise. And the reports following an audit are provided within 1 month. So the audits, the output of that is an audit report. So it will hold remarks and recommendations that are categorized in different categories. And resolutions to these recommendations are, of course, based on their criticality and are time-bound and followed up. To use this, once again, the 𝗕𝗂 system is used to define corrective and preventive actions. So it's also a part of the ICH Q10 specification on how to do that. It's also managed in the QMS. So it has its own life cycle. This also means that if a urgent 𝗕𝗂 comes in, it can be intrusive on your other planned work. Things have to come first, and it may be conflicting with your planning you were making. So the 𝗕𝗂 system allows you to formalize any incident or audit remark with a description of the problem, the root cause, risk assessments and priorities, the actions to be taken, and then all of the evidence that's needed. So the actions to be taken in short term and long term, to be clear, as discussed before. So then the last part is about some tension fields or things to keep in mind when working for regulated companies. As you may have noticed, the world of regulation is quite paper-based with slow flows that need to be approved with V models or even waterfall models. So it's quite far from the modern way of working with digital tools and agile. So you have to make sure that you can match both worlds together, which is a challenge, which often gives some discussions between IT and QA people. In the regulated companies I worked for, test management and test automation tools are in place. It is often a discussion, however, with QA people, like, should these tools be validated? If an automated test run provided certain results, are these checked by humans? Because based on the interpretations of the regulations, it may be a gray zone. Very important for decent tool assessment is also the fact that the information they have and manage should be available for 25 years. Also, this information should be human readable in documents, so it's always interesting to have a tool that allows you to export test results and certain amounts of the data. In general, I experienced that auditors are also very interested in tools or tool sets where the traceability and the end-to-end coverage of the development cycle is clearly available. So if you can explain that your tool set supports it, this can be a plus. For instance, we were using somewhere the Azure DevOps stack with Azure test plans. In Azure DevOps, user stories were defined with acceptance criteria. For those criteria, we developed acceptance tests, BDD tests in SpecFlow, and those were synced with Azure test plans automatically to have the results and everything together. So from the user story until the test result, everything was linked and could be retrieved properly. So that gives auditors confidence in the digital systems. There's a couple of things to keep in mind that I want to share with you. First of all, the potential QA pitfalls. Spoken from my experience, I am a software tester that learned bits of QA and regulatory compliance by doing it. I learned that a lot of people I relied on from the QA departments internally and externally may have some different opinions on certain interpretations. If your procedures in the company are not clear enough on those topics, it may be hard to make good decisions for your own operations yourself. So if you have some doubts, make sure that you have written them out in an email, ask for clarifications. Otherwise, you may be a bit of a play ball of opinions, and that's never good. Also, be aware of the tension there naturally is between the operational and more progressively oriented teams that want to deliver versus the QA and process, the controlling teams that want to make sure that every step is done properly. So you have to find the right balance in those teams, or discuss it in the right places. Next to that, there's also the FDA CSA, the Computer Software Assurance, that's coming up. So it's a to-be approach. It's not in place yet. It should go. It should allow us to have more a testing-oriented approach than a purely document-oriented approach. So normally, the shift should go towards 80% of applied testing and then 20% on documentation to make sure that processes progress faster. So keep in mind that in any case, all that we are doing as software testers and software focused people, it's only part of a bigger system that's also under quality control. So take the time to zoom out, see the bigger picture and discuss things, make sure that everything is working properly, because it's the whole of the applied rules, the whole of regulation that should work for your company in order to make progress. So work together and speak with each other. If you have any more questions, I will gladly answer them. Thank you.